Welcome to 221B Baker Street.
Chapter 1. The Phantom of the Locked Study. It was in the latter days of November, in the year 1894, that a dense, yellow fog settled upon London, choking the gas lamps and rendering the streets of the metropolis a labyrinth of shadows. For 3 days, neither the sun nor the familiar outlines of the buildings opposite our sitting-room window on Baker Street could be discerned. I had spent the better part of the morning engrossed in a medical journal, while my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, occupied himself with a highly odorous chemical experiment. He sat hunched over a bubbling retort, his sharp, aquiline features illuminated by the blue flame of the Bunsen burner. For hours he had remained in perfect silence, a state of hyper-focus that I had long ago learned never to interrupt. Suddenly, Holmes turned off the burner with a decisive flick of his long, stained fingers. "I see, Watson, that you have recently decided to abandon your habitual route through Regent's Park on your morning constitutionals," he remarked, his back still turned to me. I laid my journal upon my lap, accustomed to his sudden leaps of logic, but nonetheless perpetually surprised. "I have, in fact, taken to walking down Marylebone Road," I replied. "But how could you possibly know that?" "I have not mentioned it." Holmes chuckled softly, a dry, raspy sound, and pivoted in his chair. "It is child's play, my dear doctor. The mud of Regent's Park is of a distinct, reddish-brown clay, which until Tuesday last invariably clung to the inner heel of your left boot. Today, however, I observe a dusting of the pale, chalky gravel characteristic of the recent roadworks near Marylebone Station upon your trouser cuff. Furthermore, your umbrella is dry, yet it rained overnight. Therefore, you have walked under the sheltered awnings of the shop fronts rather than the open expanse of the park." "Remarkable," I murmured. "Elementary," he countered, waving a dismissive hand. "What is far more remarkable, Watson, is the frantic pace of the gentleman currently pacing the pavement below our window. He has hesitated at our door 3 times in the last 5 minutes. Ah, he has finally found his courage." A moment later, the sharp peal of the doorbell echoed up the stairs. We heard Mrs. Hudson's muffled voice, followed by the heavy, hurried tread of footsteps on the wooden risers. The door was flung open to reveal a man of striking appearance. He was tall, heavily built, and possessed the refined bearing of a statesman. He wore an immaculate sable-lined overcoat, yet his cravat was entirely askew, and his pale, drawn face was completely devoid of color. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he gasped, leaning against the doorframe. "I am he," Holmes replied, gesturing languidly toward the empty armchair near the fire. "And this is my friend and colleague, Dr. John Watson. Pray, step in, Sir Arthur. You are letting the damp air into the room." The man stumbled forward and collapsed into the chair. "You know my name. I know that the crest upon your signet ring belongs to the Penhaligon family," Holmes said, his eyes glittering with sudden interest. "And as Lord Henry Penhaligon is currently occupied as the Secretary of State for the Home Department, I deduce you must be his younger brother, Sir Arthur Penhaligon, the esteemed barrister. It is also evident from your trembling hands, your mismatched cufflinks, and the mud splattered up to your knees that you left your estate in Surrey in extraordinary haste this morning, likely before your valet had awoken." Sir Arthur stared at Holmes in profound astonishment. "They told me you were a magician, Mr. Holmes. I see they did not exaggerate." He leaned forward, resting his face in his hands. "I have come to you, sir, because I am a desperate man. A crime has been committed, a terrible, unfathomable crime, and the authorities have been explicitly ordered to turn a blind eye." Holmes steepled his fingers, his demeanor shifting from casual indifference to acute predatory focus. "The authorities ordered to stand down. By whom? By the Crown itself, Mr. Holmes," Sir Arthur whispered, his voice trembling. "Or, at the very least, by men who wield its authority. I am speaking of my brother, Lord Henry. The Home Secretary," I interjected, shocked. "Has something befallen him?" "The morning papers mentioned nothing, and they never shall, Dr. Watson," Sir Arthur replied bitterly. "If the men who control Whitehall have their way, no jury will ever hear the facts of this case." The official statement, to be released this evening, will declare that Lord Henry suffered a fatal apoplexy in his study late last night. And the truth, Holmes asked quietly. The truth, Mr. Holmes, is that my brother was murdered. Holmes leaned forward, his grey eyes piercing the gloom of the room. Pray, compose yourself, Sir Arthur, and recount to us every detail, omitting nothing, no matter how trifling it may seem to you. Sir Arthur took a deep, shuddering breath. My brother resided at a townhouse in Mayfair. Last evening, he retired to his study on the second floor, a room he utilized for reviewing highly sensitive government documents. The room has but one door and two windows. At midnight, his butler, Jenkins, heard a muffled cry from within, followed by a heavy thud. Did Jenkins investigate? Holmes asked. Immediately, but the door was locked from the inside. He called out, but received no answer. Alarmed, Jenkins summoned the footman, and together they broke the door down. I was summoned from my club, mere streets away, and arrived within 10 minutes. And what did you find? I asked, leaning forward on the edge of my seat. Henry was dead, Sir Arthur said, his voice breaking. He lay upon the Persian rug in the center of the room. The windows were bolted shut from the inside, the latches untouched. The chimney is barred with an iron grate too narrow for a child to pass through, let alone a man. Yet my brother was dead. If it was a locked room, how can you be certain it was murder and not the apoplexy the government claims? Holmes inquired. Sir Arthur reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a small, pristine, white handkerchief. He unfolded it with trembling fingers to reveal a single, horrifying object. It was a silver letter opener, its blade stained with dried, dark blood. Because, Mr. Holmes, this was driven deep into the back of his neck, severing the spinal cord. It was pulled out and left upon his desk. No man could inflict such a wound upon himself in the back of the neck, place the weapon neatly on a desk, and then collapse. Holmes' eyes shone with the fierce light of intellectual hunger. Fascinating. A locked room, an unreachable wound, and a government cover-up. Did you observe the room closely before the authorities arrived? I did, Sir Arthur replied. There was one other detail. Henry was writing a letter when he died. The pen was still in his hand, the ink trailing off the page as he fell. To whom was the letter addressed? To me, Mr. Holmes. It contained only one sentence before the pen slipped. It read, Arthur, the ghosts of the East have finally found me, and the vault is completely. That was all. Holmes sprang from his chair with a sudden burst of kinetic energy. His previous lethargy entirely vanished. He strode to the coat rack, tossing me my bowler hat before grabbing his own Inverness cape. Ghosts of the East, a locked room, and a murder no jury is allowed to hear, Holmes muttered, his voice vibrating with excitement. The government wishes to bury this, Sir Arthur, but they have forgotten one crucial detail. And what is that, Mr. Holmes? Sir Arthur asked, rising to his feet. Holmes offered a sharp, wolfish smile. They do not control me. Come, Watson, the game is afoot. Let us go and examine this impenetrable study before the agents of Whitehall sweep away our only path to the truth. Chapter 2. The anatomy of a locked room, the journey to Mayfair, was conducted in a profound and impenetrable silence. As our hansom cab rattled over the slick, fog-dampened cobblestones of London, Holmes sat rigid, his chin resting upon his hands, his eyes fixed on the murky yellow void beyond the glass. Sir Arthur Penhaligon, still pale and trembling, rode opposite us, lost in the grim labyrinth of his own grief. For my part, I withdrew my notebook, the very fireside casebook in which I chronicle my friend's singular exploits, and readied my pencil. A locked room, a murdered Home Secretary, and an overarching shadow of state interference. This promised to be an investigation of monumental peril. We are stepping well beyond our usual bounds. Watson, Holmes murmured suddenly, without turning his head from the window. To defy Whitehall is no small matter. In the eyes of the Crown this morning, we are effectively partners in crime, trespassing upon a matter of national security. I have never known you to shrink from a threat, Holmes, I replied earnestly, nor shall I start today. But keep your revolver close, old friend. When the state attempts to hide a murder, the murderer is rarely a common footpad. We alighted before an imposing Georgian townhouse in the heart of Mayfair. The heavy oak door was flanked by two burly constables, who immediately moved to bar our entry. However, Sir Arthur's sharp reprimand, backed by the enduring weight of his brother's authority, forced them to reluctantly step aside. The foyer was a scene of hushed, tense activity. At the foot of the grand, sweeping staircase stood our old acquaintance, Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard. Beside him was a man of entirely different bearing, tall, razor, thin, with a face like a locked vault and cold, unblinking eyes. "Mr. Holmes," Lestrade said, his ferret-like face flushing with a mixture of relief and anxiety. "I was hoping you might arrive, though I am explicitly ordered to send you away." "By this gentleman, no doubt?" Holmes asked, his gaze drifting lazily to the thin man. "I am Mr. Mycroft," the thin man said smoothly, his voice entirely devoid of inflection. "Special attaché to the Prime Minister. You have no jurisdiction here, Mr. Holmes. Lord Henry succumbed to a sudden medical affliction. The matter is closed." An affliction that somehow drove a silver blade into his own spine, Holmes queried, an eyebrow arched in sharp mockery. "You possess a trader's mind, sir, weighing the public panic against the political reward. But you are trading in absolute falsehoods. Step aside, or Sir Arthur shall summon the press this very minute." The government man's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but he gave a curt, tight nod. Lestrade, looking thoroughly miserable at being caught in the middle, led us up the thickly carpeted stairs. The second-floor study was a magnificent oak-panelled room, though the heavy scent of copper and impending decay hung thickly in the stagnant air. The heavy door hung off its hinges, violently splintered around the brass lock, a brutal testament to the butler's desperate entry the night before. Holmes dropped to his knees immediately, producing his silver-rimmed magnifying glass. He moved with the erratic, energetic grace of a bloodhound on a fresh scent. First, he examined the splintered wood, then the heavy brass key which lay upon the floor just inside the threshold. "The door was certainly locked from the inside," Holmes muttered, his nose practically touching the woven threads of the Persian carpet. The key was turned, and the bolt thrown. "Excellent." He bounded up and darted to the windows. Both were securely fastened with heavy iron latches that showed no signs of tampering, dirt, or disturbance. He pressed his face against the glass, inspecting the frames before turning his attention to the roaring fireplace. The iron grate was indeed too narrow for even a small dog to pass, and a fire had been burning throughout the night, completely eliminating the chimney as a route of escape. "A veritable hermitage," Holmes declared, his grey eyes shining with fierce intellectual joy. He turned to the massive mahogany desk where the tragedy had culminated. The body had already been removed by the agents of Whitehall, leaving only a dark, terrible stain upon the green blotting paper. Along the walls, iron safes and heavy wooden cabinets stood silently. They were the silent files of an empire, housing diplomatic secrets that men would clearly kill to protect. He was seated here, Holmes deduced, pacing rapidly around the desk. He was writing the frantic note to his brother. The assailant struck from behind, a single, powerful blow with a letter opener. But how did the murderer vanish into thin air, leaving a perfectly locked room behind? "Perhaps a secret passage," Lestrade suggested, tapping the oak panels near the bookshelves. "We have sounded the walls, though, and found absolutely nothing hollow." Holmes did not answer. He was staring intently at a heavy brass inkwell that sat near the edge of the desk. He leaned in, sniffing the rim, and then picked up a discarded quill pen, examining the feather and the nib with immense care. I watched him slip the quill into his heavy coat pocket with a swift, subtle motion that Lestrade entirely missed. "Well, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade prompted, rubbing his hands together, "what do you make of it? Have the ghosts of the East simply vanished through the solid walls?" Holmes stood up, his sharp face an impenetrable mask. He brushed the dust from the knees of his trousers and offered a cryptic, thin-lipped smile. "They have not vanished, Lestrade. They have simply changed their shape," Holmes replied softly. "The room is exactly as it appears, a perfect, unbroken seal. The murderer did not leave through the door, the window, or the chimney." In fact, my dear Inspector, the murderer never entered the room at all. Chapter 3. The Shadows of the Reborn Protocol. Never entered the room. Lestrade ejaculated. His ferret, like face a picture of absolute bewilderment. He threw his hands up in a gesture of profound exasperation. Be reasonable, Mr. Holmes. The man was violently struck in the back of the neck with a solid silver letter opener. Are you suggesting the weapon flew through the heavy oak door of its own accord? Or perhaps it materialized from the very fog outside? I am suggesting neither, Inspector, Holmes replied with maddening calmness. He leaned against the edge of the mahogany desk, his long, lean frame completely at ease amidst the grim surroundings. I merely state a physical fact. You have seen the undisturbed dust upon the window, latches. You have witnessed the shattered door locked firmly from the inside, with the key still upon the floor. You have examined the narrow, soot-choked chimney. It is a physical impossibility for a full-grown man to have occupied this space and vanished. Therefore, we must eliminate the impossible. Then, how was the deed done? Demanded Mr. Mycroft, the government attaché, his cold voice cutting through the damp air of the study. His unblinking eyes were fixed upon my friend with a mixture of hostility and reluctant apprehension. That, sir, is precisely what we are here to ascertain, Holmes said, his eyes flashing. But before we delve into the mechanics of this grim parlor trick, I must speak with the man who first discovered the tragedy. Sir Arthur, would you be so kind as to summon your brother's butler? Sir Arthur Penhaligon nodded weakly and stepped out into the corridor. A heavy, oppressive silence fell over the room. I took the opportunity to inspect the fireplace. The embers were entirely dead, leaving behind a thick mound of grey ash. I knelt upon the hearthrug and sifted through the powdery remnants with a pair of brass fire tongs, hoping to find some unburnt fragment of a letter or document. Alas, my amateur investigation yielded nothing. There were no warm clues to be found in the grate, only the bitter chill of a fire that had long since expired. Moments later, Sir Arthur returned, followed by a stout, balding man in the sombre, impeccable attire of a senior servant. Jenkins the butler was visibly trembling, his face the colour of old parchment, and he wrung his hands together with a nervous, rhythmic desperation. You are Jenkins, I presume? Holmes asked, his tone suddenly adopting a gentle, almost hypnotic cadence. I am, sir, the butler replied, his voice quavering. A terrible shock for you, Jenkins. Truly terrible. Tell me, at what precise hour did you last see Lord Henry alive? At 10:30, sir, Jenkins answered, standing rigidly at attention despite his tremors. I brought up his lordship's evening tea and a plate of biscuits, just as I have done every night for the past 7 years. He was seated at this very desk, sir, looking quite distressed. He instructed me to lock the door behind me and under no circumstances to disturb him, not even for the Prime Minister himself. And did you lock the door? I did not have to, sir. As soon as I stepped into the hall, I heard his lordship turn the key and throw the heavy brass bolt. It makes a very distinct, heavy clack, sir. I know the sound well. I see, Holmes murmured, his eyes darting to the servant's pristine cuffs. And where were you when you heard the fatal cry at midnight? In the silver pantry, on the ground floor, sir. I was polishing the dining service. It was a sharp, sudden shout, more of a gasp, really followed by a heavy thud that shook the floorboards. I ran up the stairs immediately. When his lordship did not answer my calls, I fetched the footman, and we broke the lock. A commendable and swift reaction, Holmes noted smoothly. One final question, Jenkins. This silver letter opener, was it a permanent fixture upon the desk? Jenkins blinked, his brow furrowing. Yes, sir. It has sat upon that green blotter for as long as I have served this house. It is quite heavy, sir. Solid silver. Thank you, Jenkins. You may go. Holmes dismissed him with a wave of his hand. As the butler hurriedly retreated, Lestrade crossed his arms. Well, that confirms it, Mr. Holmes. The man was alone. It must have been a suicide. The angle of the wound is bizarre, I grant you, but madness makes men do strange things. Madness, Lestrade, rarely possesses the presence of mind to neatly extract a blade from its own spine and lay it respectfully upon a desk. Holmes retorted dryly. He pushed himself off the desk and walked over to the heavy iron safe embedded in the far wall. The door of the safe was slightly ajar. Holmes pulled the heavy iron door, wide open inside. A series of empty velvet-lined shelves mocked us. But upon the lowest shelf, pushed far into the darkest corner, lay a single, thick manila folder. Holmes reached in with his long fingers and extracted it. It appears our murderer, or our victim, was in a great hurry, Holmes observed. Mr. Mycroft took a sudden, sharp step forward, his previous composure shattering. Mr. Holmes, you will hand that over immediately. That is property of the Crown. Holmes ignored him entirely, flipping open the folder. His eyes scanned the first page, and a grim smile played upon his thin lips. Fascinating, he whispered. It seems Lord Henry was not merely managing domestic affairs. He was overseeing a highly classified colonial initiative. Holmes turned the document so I could read the bold, black ink stamped across the top of the parchment. It was titled The Reborn Protocol. What does it mean, Holmes? I asked, feeling a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the London fog. It means, Watson, that the ghosts of the East are very real, and they have incredibly long memories, Holmes replied softly, snapping the folder shut and slipping it swiftly into his coat pocket before the government agent could snatch it. The stage is set, gentlemen. The misdirection of this locked room is merely the opening act. Come, Watson. We have a visit to make in the East End. We must find a ghost before it strikes again. Chapter 4, The Sacrificial Lamb of Limehouse, the journey from the aristocratic splendor of Mayfair to the squalid festering heart of the East End was a descent into an altogether different world. As our hansom cab rattled eastward, the wide gas-lit avenues gave way to narrow, twisting alleys choked with acrid cold smoke and the foul stench of the river at low tide. The dense London fog seemed to thicken here, clinging to the rotting brickwork of the tenements like a damp, suffocating shroud. Holmes sat opposite me, swaying with the motion of the cab, as he struck a lucifer match to illuminate the stolen manila folder. The brief, sulphurous flare cast a demonic glow upon his sharp, ascetic features as his eyes darted rapidly across the typewritten pages. "This reborn protocol, Watson," he began, his voice barely audible over the clatter of hooves on the uneven cobblestones, "is a document of extraordinary consequence. It appears Lord Henry was secretly utilizing his cabinet position to dismantle a vast and highly lucrative opium and antiquities smuggling ring operating out of the Orient. He was aggressively seizing their shipments at the docks and freezing their banking assets across the empire. A noble endeavor, I noted, pulling my coat tighter against the creeping damp. Noble, perhaps, but profoundly perilous. The men commanding this syndicate are not mere street toughs or dockside bruisers. They are men of immense wealth and influence. Truly, Watson, they are partners in crime operating on a global coordinated scale, and to protect their empire, they have cultivated a vast network of disgruntled former officials and paid informants at their disposal. Holmes tapped a long, slender finger against a specific name near the bottom of the file. Observe this entry, Elias Thorne. Formerly a senior customs clerk at the Port of London, he was dismissed with extreme prejudice by Lord Henry 6 months ago on suspicion of facilitating bribery. Thorne fiercely maintained his innocence. In fact, the file notes he filed an appeal directly to the Home Office, begging for a formal tribunal to clear his tarnished name. Lord Henry personally denied it without a hearing, leaving Thorne ruined, disgraced, and entirely penniless. "And you believe Thorne murdered him in revenge?" I asked, feeling a surge of adrenaline. "I believe Thorne is the loose thread we must pull to unravel this sweater," Holmes corrected smoothly. "He currently resides in a miserable boarding house near the Limehouse docks. We shall pay him a visit and see how he spent his evening." We alighted near a dismal, sagging structure that leaned precariously over the black, swirling waters of the Thames. The air was thick with the smell of rotting fish and cheap gin. Holmes did not hesitate. He led the way up a dark, rotting wooden staircase, pausing before a scarred door on the uppermost landing. He did not knock, but instead threw the door open with a sudden violent thrust of his shoulder. The cramped room was dimly lit by a single, sputtering tallow candle. A man sat hunched over a rickety table, nursing a chipped bottle of spirits. He was gaunt and dishevelled, his eyes bloodshot and wide with absolute terror as we burst in. This was Elias Thorne. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," Thorne croaked, shrinking back in his chair and clutching the bottle. I knew it was only a matter of time before the government hounds were set upon me. "But you are too late. I swear before God Almighty, I did not kill him." "We have not even mentioned a murder, Mr. Thorne," Holmes noted coldly, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. "Yet your mind leaps immediately to Lord Henry's demise. How very revealing." Thorne's trembling hands knocked the glass from the table, shattering it upon the floorboards. "Word travels fast in the docks, Mr. Holmes. I heard the whispers an hour ago. The great Lord Henry struck down in his fortress. But I was here all night," asked the landlord. Holmes ignored the man's desperate, weeping pleas. Instead, his eyes swept the squalid room with terrifying, predatory speed. He moved toward the small, unmade cot in the corner. From beneath the thin, stained mattress, he pulled out a heavy, dark woolen ulster coat. "If you were here all night, Mr. Thorne," Holmes said, holding the heavy coat to the candlelight. "How do you explain this?" He pointed to the hem of the garment. It was thickly caked with a pale, chalky gravel. "That is the distinct gravel from the Marylebone roadworks," I exclaimed, recognizing the very mud Holmes had identified upon my own trousers that morning. "The exact path one would take if fleeing Mayfair toward the underground stations." "Precisely, Watson," Holmes said. He reached into the coat's deep pocket and extracted a crumpled piece of paper. He smoothed it out upon the table. It was a train ticket from Victoria Station, stamped with yesterday's date, alongside a heavily soiled pair of leather gloves. The fingertips of the gloves bore a dark, unmistakable rusty stain, dried blood. At that exact moment, heavy footsteps thundered up the wooden stairs, and Inspector Lestrade burst into the room, flanked by two burly Scotland Yard constables. "I followed your carriage, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade panted, his eyes immediately falling upon the bloody gloves and the ruined clerk. "And it seems I was entirely justified to do so. Elias Thorne, I arrest you for the murder of Lord Henry Penhaligon." Thorne collapsed to his knees, weeping in a pitiful, wretched wail. "I am framed. I swear it on my mother's grave. I was sent an anonymous message to go to Mayfair last night, but I lost my nerve and never went inside. I found those gloves stuffed in my pocket this morning." "A likely story for the judge," Lestrade scoffed, securing heavy iron cuffs around Thorne's thin wrists. "The motive? The Marylebone mud, the bloody gloves in his own pocket. It is an open and shut case, Mr. Holmes. I thank you for doing the legwork, but the Yard will take it from here." As the constables dragged the sobbing, broken man out into the corridor, I turned to Holmes, fully expecting a look of triumph upon his face. Instead, my friend's features were dark with an angry, brooding intensity. "Is something amiss, Holmes?" I asked, in genuine confusion. "The evidence is overwhelming." "That is precisely what is amiss, Watson," Holmes hissed, his grey eyes narrowing into cold, calculating slits. "It is entirely too overwhelming. The mud is too thickly applied, the gloves too carelessly discarded, the train ticket too conveniently preserved. The man is a terrified drunkard, not a master assassin who could orchestrate a locked room murder. We are being played for absolute fools, old friend. Elias Thorne is not our murderer. He is the sacrificial lamb, laid out to satisfy the Yard and distract us, while the true architect of this tragedy stalks the shadows." Chapter 5. The whisper in the ink. We returned to Baker Street in a silence that was far more oppressive than the yellow fog clinging to the window panes. Inspector Lestrade was entirely convinced of his triumph, and the official machinery of Scotland Yard was moving swiftly to seal Elias Thorne's fate before the week was out. But for Sherlock Holmes, the premature closure of the case was a festering thorn. He paced the length of our sitting room with the relentless, predatory stride of a caged animal, his dressing gown billowing behind him. "Think of it, Watson," he exclaimed, suddenly spinning on his heel to face me. A man commits a murder so mechanically baffling that it mocks the very laws of physics, a true locked-room masterpiece. Yet, this same criminal mastermind supposedly leaves his muddy coat under a mattress, retains blood-stained gloves in plain sight, and drops a railway ticket into his own pocket like an absent-minded tourist. It is an insult to logic. It is a theatrical performance staged to satisfy a gullible inspector. If Thorne is merely a pawn, I said, setting my pipe aside, then who placed those items in his room? And more importantly, how was the murder in the Mayfair study actually committed? Holmes did not answer immediately. He walked over to his cluttered side table and picked up the item he had secretly pocketed from Lord Henry's desk during our initial inspection. The heavy brass inkwell. He carried it to the window, holding it up against the dim, sickly light of morning. His sharp, aquiline features tightened in intense concentration as he pulled his silver-rimmed magnifying glass from his waistcoat pocket. I took this not merely as a keepsake, Watson, but because of a faint, sweet almond scent that caught my attention amidst the stench of copper and decay, Holmes murmured, unscrewing the heavy brass lid. He dipped a clean quill pen into the dark fluid, drew a single line across a scrap of white paper, and sniffed it deeply. A slow, triumphant smile spread across his lips. As I suspected, this is not standard government-issue ink. It is a custom-blended gall ink infused with oil of bitter almonds, a rare and volatile compound utilized almost exclusively by high-ranking cartographers and master forgers. A forger? I queried, standing up. What does forgery have to do with a locked-room murder? Everything, Holmes declared, his eyes flashing with brilliant clarity. Lord Henry was not merely a statesman cracking down on antiquities smuggling. He was actively investigating a vast financial conspiracy centered around the Reborn Protocol. The folder we recovered was merely a decoy, a collection of mid-level customs infractions designed to look like the true threat. Holmes reached into his pocket and withdrew the stolen manila folder, flipping rapidly through its contents, until he reached a seemingly blank sheet of thick parchment at the very back. He held it over the blue flame of his spirit lamp. To my absolute astonishment, hidden chemical writing sympathetic ink began to char and glow under the gentle heat, revealing a dense network of names, dates, and banking accounts. Good heavens, I gasped, peering over his shoulder. That is a ledger of bribery reaching into the highest echelons of Whitehall. Cabinet ministers, foreign investors, and, wait, look at the signature at the bottom. Holmes tilted the parchment toward the light. The name scrawled at the foot of the document was partially obscured by a dark ink blot, but the distinctive, elegant handwriting was unmistakable. It belonged not to Elias Thorne, nor to some shadowy East End syndicate, but to a man who had stood with us in that very study just hours before. Mr. Mycroft, I breathed, the horrific realization dawning upon me, the special attaché to the Prime Minister. Precisely, Holmes said, his voice dropping to a cold, dangerous whisper. Mycroft, not the government official of that name, but an impostor using forged credentials and a stolen title, is the true architect of the syndicate. He orchestrated the theft of the state secrets, and when Lord Henry discovered the betrayal, he had to be silenced permanently. But Holmes, the locked room, I protested, struggling to reconcile the physical evidence. The doors were bolted from the inside. The windows were latched. The chimney was a barrier. How could anyone kill the Home Secretary and leave no trace? Holmes chuckled softly, a sound devoid of mirth, and walked over to his chemical table. He picked up a small, hollow glass vial filled with a clear, volatile liquid. The locked room was never a physical impossibility, Watson. It was an illusion built upon timing, pressure, and chemistry, Holmes explained. Setting the vial down with a sharp click, the murderer did not need to escape the room after the crime, because the crime was committed hours before the door was ever locked. Before the door was locked, I echoed, completely bewildered. Recall the testimony of Jenkins, the butler, Holmes continued, pacing rhythmically. Lord Henry was seated at his desk at 10:30, writing a frantic letter to his brother. Jenkins brought tea and was told to leave. As Jenkins stepped into the hall, he heard the key turn and the heavy brass bolt slide into place. He assumed Lord Henry locked himself in. And didn't he? Not at all, Holmes said, his eyes glittering with triumph. The murderer was already inside the study, hiding behind the heavy velvet drapes, or within the dark alcove of the iron safe. When Jenkins departed, the assassin struck swiftly from behind, driving the silver letter opener deep into Lord Henry's spine. But if the murderer was still inside, I argued, how did he lock the door from the inside and vanish when the butler broke it down? Because he did not lock it from the inside after the murder, Holmes said smoothly. He locked it before the butler ever arrived, using a brilliant piece of mechanical trickery. A simple thread, a bent pin, and a counterweight of melting ice left upon the latch can cause a heavy bolt to slide shut moments after a person departs. Or better yet, the door was never locked by the occupant at all. The assassin slipped out of the room through the connecting service panel while the house was in turmoil, leaving the bolt rigged to throw itself shut via a spring mechanism. An ingenious mechanism. A voice suddenly echoed from the shadows of our landing. I whipped around, my hand instinctively flying toward my service revolver. Standing at the threshold of our sitting room, framed by the dim gaslight of the hallway, was the tall, razor-thin man who had introduced himself as Mycroft, the government attaché. But his posture had completely changed. The cold, robotic stiffness was gone, replaced by an easy, lethal grace. In his right hand, he casually held a heavy, silver-plated revolver, its barrel aimed squarely at my chest. "You are a remarkably perceptive man, Mr. Holmes," the impostor said, his lips curling into a chilling, elegant smile. "Too perceptive for your own good. And now, unfortunately, our little game of deduction must come to a permanent end." Chapter 6. The Trap of the Silver Blade. The sudden deadly shift in the atmosphere of our Baker Street sitting room was absolute. The man calling himself Mycroft stood poised in the doorway, the heavy silver-plated revolver steady in his grasp. The faint, sweet smell of bitter almond oil seemed to drift from his immaculate coat, confirming beyond a shadow of a doubt that the architect of the Mayfair tragedy had walked directly into our lion's den. I moved to draw my service revolver from its holster resting upon the side table, but the chilling click of the intruder's hammer, cocking back, froze me in my tracks. "I should advise you against sudden heroics, Dr. Watson," the impostor purred, his voice smooth and devoid of any previous bureaucratic stiffness. "My finger is remarkably light upon this hair, trigger, and the distance between us is negligible. It would be a tragic end for a chronicler of such immense talent." Holmes, however, did not flinch. He remained standing by his chemical table, his long fingers resting lightly upon the edge of the mahogany surface. There was no trace of panic in his grey eyes. Instead, they burned with a fierce, calculating intensity that seemed to unsettle our uninvited guest. "Put down the weapon, Colonel," Holmes said softly, his voice cutting through the thick, tense air with absolute authority. "Or rather, I should say, Colonel Sebastian Moran's most capable lieutenant. You miscalculated from the very beginning, Mr. Mycroft. A man who plays the role of a cold government attaché should never wear the distinct regalia of a retired colonial artillery officer upon his waistcoat buttons." The impostor's eyes narrowed imperceptibly, a momentary flash of surprise betraying his iron composure. "You are remarkably observant, Mr. Holmes, but observation will do little to stop a bullet." "On the contrary," Holmes countered, a thin, wolfish smile touching his lips. "Observation has already accomplished everything required. You assume you have walked into a trap of your own making, sir, but you forget a fundamental rule of London fog. Visibility is entirely a matter of perspective." Before the man could tighten his finger upon the trigger, Holmes executed a sudden, violent sweep of his arm, hurling a small glass retort directly into the brass wall, sconce above the fireplace. The vessel shattered instantly, releasing a thick, blinding cloud of violet, tinged smoke, and an overpowering, pungent odor of burning sulfur and ammonia. A deafening roar shattered the silence as the intruder fired blindly into the haze. The bullet splintered the wooden wainscoting inches from my head. I dropped instantly to the carpet, drawing my revolver, but I heard the sharp, frantic clatter of heavy footsteps rushing down our wooden staircase. "He's escaping," I shouted, coughing through the acrid smoke. "Let him run, Watson," Holmes called out, his voice sharp and steady as he waved away the vapors with his dressing gown. "He has nowhere left to run. The net is already drawn." I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Holmes, are you mad? He is armed and dangerous, and he possesses the true ledger of the reborn protocol." "He possesses nothing of the sort," Holmes replied smoothly, walking over to his desk and picking up a familiar manila folder. He opened it to reveal that the secret chemical ledger had been safely swapped out for a stack of blank newsprint. The true documents were secured hours ago, entrusted to a reliable courier bound directly for Scotland Yard's highest commissioner. The real one, not our friend from the colonies. I stared at him in profound astonishment. "You anticipated his visit?" "Elementary, my dear Watson," Holmes said, beginning to rapidly assemble his travelling kit, tossing his Inverness cape and a sturdy walking stick onto the sofa. "A criminal syndicate that goes to such elaborate lengths to fabricate a locked-room murder and frame a wretched clerk will not leave loose ends dangling. When we dismantled Elias Thorne's alibi, I knew the true mastermind would feel the noose tightening. He had to silence the only men who deduced the chronological flaw in the murder timeline. Ourselves, then the confrontation downstairs, your diversion. It was all part of a plan. "It was the final movement of the piece," Holmes declared, his eyes flashing with brilliant triumph. "The impostor believes he has intimidated us, but in his desperate haste to eliminate the threat, he has committed a fatal tactical error. He has fled back to the syndicate's primary stronghold to destroy the remaining evidence." "And where might that be?" I asked, reaching eagerly for my bowler hat and heavy overcoat. Holmes offered a sharp, exhilarating smile as he checked the loading of his pocket pistol. "To the abandoned subterranean railway terminus beneath Charing Cross, Watson. The ghosts of the East are about to discover that Baker Street has brought a very bright light into their darkness. Come, old friend, let us see if our quarry can run faster than the truth." Chapter 7. The Subterranean Vault of Charing Cross. The descent into the disused subterranean railway terminus. Beneath Charing Cross was akin to entering the very belly of a Victorian industrial nightmare. As Holmes and I slipped past the rusted iron gates that barred the disused tunnel from the active district line, the damp, stagnant air grew thick with the smell of coal dust, stagnant river seepage, and decaying timber. The flickering amber glow of our single hurricane lantern cast long, grotesque shadows that danced wildly across the curved brick walls of the tunnel. "Step carefully, Watson," Holmes whispered, his voice barely carrying above the distant, subterranean rumble of a passing commuter train echoing through the stone. "We are treading upon ground that the city has long since forgotten, but our aristocratic impostor has not." We pressed forward, navigating the treacherous wooden sleepers of the abandoned tracks. The darkness ahead was absolute, a heavy velvet void that seemed to swallow the feeble light of our lantern. For nearly 20 minutes, we traversed the winding subterranean labyrinth, guided solely by Holmes' uncanny sense of direction and the faint, recurring draft of fresh air drawing toward an unknown ventilation shaft ahead. Suddenly, Holmes raised a gloved hand, bringing us to an instantaneous halt. He extinguished the lantern with a swift twist of the thumbscrew, plunging us into total obsidian darkness. "Listen," he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. I strained my ears, shutting out the sound of my own racing pulse. Faintly, filtering through a narrow crack in the damp brickwork a dozen yards ahead, came the muffled murmur of agitated voices, a narrow slice of golden lamplight cut horizontally across the dark rails. Signaling for me to remain silent, Holmes crept forward like a stalking panther, hugging the curved brick wall until he reached the fissure. I followed close behind, pressing my eye to the narrow gap. What lay beyond was a revelation. The natural brickwork opened into a vast vaulted subterranean chamber. Evidently, an old storage depot for the subterranean railway, now converted into a clandestine meeting place. Heavy Persian rugs were thrown across the damp stone floor, and crates marked with the insignia of the East India Company served as makeshift tables. Piled upon them were ledgers, gold sovereigns, and the unmistakable paraphernalia of a massive smuggling ring. Standing in the center of the chamber was the impostor who had posed as our government attaché, his immaculate coat now splattered with mud and soot. He was speaking rapidly to a squat, heavily bearded man who paced the floor like an enraged bear. Holmes deduced the chronology of the locked room trick. The impostor hissed, his voice echoing sharply against the vaulted ceiling. He realized the murder was executed before Jenkins locked the door from the outside, using the delayed release spring mechanism on the bolt. If we do not burn the remaining shipping manifests tonight, the whole empire will come crashing down upon us. Calm yourself, Captain, the bearded man growled, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble. The shipment from Calcutta arrives at dawn. Once the final crates are cleared, we scatter to the continent. Holmes and his doctor are merely two meddling flies. They cannot prove a thing without the true ledger, and that remains safely hidden within the walled safe of my Mayfair residence, completely untouched. Are you entirely certain of that? A cool, ringing voice suddenly echoed from the shadowed archway behind them. Both men whipped around with matching gasps of sheer terror. Holmes stepped smoothly out of the dark tunnel entrance, his tall, lean frame silhouetted against the dim light, his service revolver held with absolute terrifying steadiness. I materialized immediately beside him, my own weapon drawn and covering the burly leader. Mr. Holmes, the impostor stammered, stumbling backward against a crate of gold sovereigns, his face entirely draining of color. How did you find this place? It is a very simple matter, my dear fellow, when one realizes that the Underground Railway network is the only logical artery connecting the Mayfair townhouses to the East End docks without passing through Scotland Yard's checkpoints. Holmes replied, his eyes gleaming with cold triumph. As for your ledger in the Mayfair safe, I am afraid you will find it remarkably difficult to retrieve. The bearded leader let out a ferocious roar of rage, his hand diving instinctively toward a heavy navy revolver tucked inside his heavy wool coat. I wouldn't advise that, Holmes warned, his finger tightening imperceptibly on the trigger, unless you wish to join Lord Henry in the great beyond before your trial has even commenced. The heavy weapon slipped from the leader's trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the stone floor. The sprawling syndicate, built upon a foundation of clever illusions, high-level betrayal, and a seemingly impossible locked-room murder, had finally reached the end of its line. Holmes lowered his pistol just an inch, a sardonic smile playing upon his lips as he surveyed the magnificent stash of stolen wealth. It appears, Watson, he remarked dryly, that our little nocturnal excursion has yielded quite a bountiful harvest. Scotland Yard is going to be exceptionally busy tomorrow morning. Boti by Epizen. Chapter 8. The Architecture of an Illusion, the Journey from the Subterranean Depths of Charing Cross back to the crisp, damp air of Baker Street was accomplished amidst a flurry of official activity. Inspector Lestrade, hastily summoned to the disused railway terminus by a messenger pigeon dispatched by Holmes, had arrived with a full detachment of Scotland Yard constables. The underground vault was swiftly transformed from a clandestine den of international smuggling into a secure holding pen for the collapsed syndicate. The impostor who had masqueraded as a government attaché, along with his bearded confederate and their cowering confederates, were placed in heavy irons and escorted away to the cells of Bow Street. It was well past 3 o'clock in the morning when Holmes and I finally settled back into our familiar leather armchairs by the hearth in Baker Street. The coal fire crackled warmly, casting long, comforting shadows across our cluttered sitting room. A kettle was hissing softly upon the hob, and I poured 2 generous measures of steaming tea, handing one to my friend, who sat cross-legged in his chair, with his fingertips steepled beneath his chin. Well, Holmes, I said, sinking back into the cushions with a contented sigh. The syndicate is dismantled, the true ledger of the reborn protocol is safely in the hands of the Commissioner, and Elias Thorne will undoubtedly be released from custody by sunrise. Yet, despite all of our success, there is one critical detail that continues to plague my mind. Holmes raised an inquiring eyebrow, a faint, amused smile playing upon his thin lips. And what might that be, my dear Watson? Is it the origin of the bitter almond oil, or perhaps the precise route of the East India Company's smuggling vessels? No, I replied, leaning forward earnestly. It is the locked room itself. I understand the chronology now. Your deduction that the murder was committed hours before Jenkins locked the door from the outside, using a mechanical delayed release mechanism on the heavy brass bolt. But how was the physical wound inflicted with such lethal precision while Lord Henry sat at his desk? And how did the assassin manage to leave the silver letter opener behind without attracting the attention of the household? Holmes chuckled softly, a dry, pleased sound, and reached into his dressing gown pocket, withdrawing a small, slender object. It was a length of fine, nearly invisible silk cord, accompanied by a tiny, ingeniously bent steel spring mechanism. You have always possessed an admirable curiosity, Watson, though your engineering mind sometimes struggles with the elegant simplicity of a master criminal's artistry, Holmes said, tossing the small contraption onto the green blotter between us. The solution to the locked room mystery did not require supernatural intervention, nor did it require the assassin to remain hidden in the room until the butler broke the door down. It was a triumph of physics and timing. Pray, explain, I urged, adjusting my spectacles. Consider the timeline, Holmes began, his voice dropping into its lecturing, analytical cadence. Lord Henry was sitting at his desk at 10:30 at night, composing a frantic note to his brother regarding the betrayal within Whitehall. The impostor, our false government attaché, had gained entry earlier in the evening under the guise of an official state consultation. While Lord Henry momentarily turned his attention to a document in his iron safe, the assassin struck from directly behind, driving the heavy silver letter opener deep into the Home Secretary's spine with a single, practiced blow. And the weapon, I interjected, how was it removed and left upon the desk? That, Watson, was the masterstroke of the illusion, Holmes explained, leaning forward and tapping the table with a long finger. The assassin did not pull the weapon out immediately. Instead, he attached this fine length of invisible silk cord to the hilt of the silver letter opener, routing the thread upward through the narrow iron bars of the fireplace chimney and down again to the outer corridor via a small, pre-drilled aperture near the upper molding of the study door. Good heavens, I gasped, the pieces falling into place with terrifying clarity. A pulley system. Precisely, Holmes nodded. After inflicting the fatal wound, the assassin quietly slipped out of the study through the service door while the household was still quiet. He paused in the hallway, pulled the door shut, and slid the heavy brass bolt into place. Then, standing safely in the corridor, he gave a steady, firm tug upon the silk cord threaded through the door molding. The letter opener was pulled free from the wound, I whispered, visualizing the grim scene. Indeed, the weapon slid across the desk and came to rest near the blotting paper, while the silk cord, being paper-thin and pulled at a sharp angle, slipped effortlessly through the narrow crack above the doorframe. The assassin simply wound the thread around his finger, pocketed it along with the tiny steel spring used to weight the descent, and walked calmly down the stairs, leaving behind a perfectly sealed room that appeared to defy the very laws of nature. I stared at my friend in profound admiration. The intricate puzzle, which had baffled Scotland Yard and terrified the highest echelons of the British government, was reduced to a matter of mechanics and cold, unyielding logic. A truly diabolical scheme, I murmured. And yet it completely unraveled the moment it encountered a pair of eyes willing to look past the illusion. Holmes smiled, rising lazily from his chair to stretch his long limbs. Illusion is merely the playground of the unimaginative, Watson. Truth, however complex, always leaves a fingerprint for those who take the trouble to look. He walked over to his violin case, resting against the wall, gently lifting the polished wood instrument from its lining. The hour is late, old friend, and the London fog is finally beginning to lift. I believe a little Mendelssohn is entirely in order to celebrate the close of a most satisfactory investigation. Chapter 9. The Unfinished Symphony of Whitehall. The gentle strains of Mendelssohn drifted through our Baker Street apartments, washing away the lingering taint of subterranean damp and international conspiracy. By the time the afternoon sun managed to pierce the thinning remnants of the November fog, transforming the grey London sky into a pale, bruised violet, The physical realities of our victory had begun to settle upon us. The morning newspapers, though carefully managed by the discreet interventions of true government authorities, could not entirely suppress the seismic tremors shaking Whitehall. Headlines spoke vaguely of administrative restructuring within the Home Office and the sudden health-related retirement of several high-ranking colonial advisers. Elias Thorne had been quietly released from the cells of Bow Street, provided with a handsome government stipend and a clean slate, a modest restitution for a man nearly sacrificed upon the altar of high-level treason. I sat at my writing desk, my fountain pen scratching steadily across the heavy vellum pages of my journal, meticulously recording the final details of the locked room enigma. Across the room, Sherlock Holmes stood by the window, his violin tucked neatly beneath his chin, coaxing a final melancholy melody from the strings. Suddenly, a sharp, double knock at our front door echoed up the stairwell, followed by the familiar heavy tread of Mrs. Hudson's footsteps. "A telegram for you, Mr. Holmes," our landlady announced, pushing the door open just enough to deposit a small, blue envelope upon the side table before retreating downstairs with a polite nod. Holmes lowered his bow, his eyes narrowing slightly. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, picked up the envelope, and tore open the adhesive seal with a swift flick of his thumb. He scanned the typewritten message once, a curious smile playing at the corner of his thin lips, before handing the slip of paper to me. I took the telegram and read it aloud. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, 221 B Baker Street. The Prime Minister requests your presence at Downing Street at 4 o'clock this afternoon. An urgent matter of state requires the uncompromising touch of the state's most uncommissioned consultant. Transport will wait at your door." I looked up from the paper, my eyebrows raised in profound surprise. "Downing Street. The Prime Minister himself summons you," after we practically dismantled half his cabinet and upended a secret colonial protocol. Holmes chuckled softly, laying his violin carefully back into its velvet-lined case. "Power, my dear Watson, has a remarkable capacity for pragmatism. When a government is threatened by corruption from within, it detests nothing more than a scandal. But when that scandal is successfully neutralized and the state's secrets are quietly recovered without a public trial, the administration finds itself deeply, quietly indebted to the man who accomplished the feat." "And you intend to go?" I asked, reaching instinctively for my bowler hat. "Naturally," Holmes replied, sweeping his heavy Inverness cape from the coat rack and fastening it about his shoulders with practiced efficiency. "It would be thoroughly impolite to keep the leader of the British Empire waiting. Besides, I am exceedingly curious to see what manner of decorative tea service the Prime Minister keeps in his private study. Come, Watson, let us go and collect our well-earned laurels. Or, at the very least, a very stiff glass of government brandy." We descended the stairs and stepped out onto Baker Street. True to the telegram's word, a sleek, unmarked black brougham with a pair of matching bay horses stood idling by our curb. A solemn coachman touched the brim of his top hat as we approached, holding the carriage door wide. As the vehicle rolled smoothly through the bustling, gas-lit avenues of Westminster, the heavy weight of the past week's perils seemed to dissolve into the crisp autumn air. The locked room had been unlocked, the phantom of the East had been laid to rest, and the intricate web of deception woven by Colonel Moran's syndicate had been thoroughly unravelled by the pure, unyielding light of logic. We alighted before the unassuming yet formidable black door of number 10, Downing Street. A junior secretary, visibly nervous and exceedingly polite, awaited us upon the threshold, ushering us swiftly past polished mahogany wainscoting and portraits of past statesmen into a magnificent, book-lined private parlour. The Prime Minister was a tall, distinguished gentleman with silvering hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that conveyed both the crushing burdens of an empire and a sudden, quiet glint of profound gratitude. "Mr. Holmes," the statesman said, stepping forward from his mahogany desk and extending his hand with unfeigned warmth, "and Dr. Watson, words cannot adequately express the debt this nation owes to your discretion and your singular genius." Holmes accepted the handshake with his characteristic, cool detachment, though a polite inclination of his head acknowledged the compliment. "It was merely an intellectual exercise, Prime Minister." though I must confess, the mechanics of the locked room required a certain artistic appreciation. The Prime Minister smiled, gesturing us toward two plush leather chairs near the crackling fireplace. Indeed, and I assure you, Mr. Holmes, the administrative measures we have taken in the wake of your discoveries ensure that the reborn protocol will never again be exploited for personal gain. The state remained secure. As we seated ourselves, accepting the offer of the promised brandy, I glanced across the room at my remarkable friend. The firelight danced upon his sharp, ascetic features, illuminating a mind already racing ahead toward the next unsolved puzzle waiting in the shadows of the metropolis. For Sherlock Holmes, peace was merely the brief intermission between acts in the grand, unending drama of human folly. And as I raised my glass in silent toast to his brilliance, I knew with absolute certainty that London would never run out of mysteries, nor would it ever find another mind quite like his. Chapter 10. The final deduction. The heavy oak doors of Downing Street closed behind us with a satisfying, muffled thud, as Inspector Lestrade's sleek black brougham deposited us safely back upon the familiar flagstones of Baker Street. The late November twilight had deepened into a rich indigo, and the gas lamps along our thoroughfare flickered to life, casting long, wavering beams across the damp pavement. As we climbed the 17 wooden steps to our apartments, the wear and tear of the past tumultuous week seemed to fall away, replaced by the quiet, comforting sanctuary of our sitting room. Mrs. Hudson had been busy in our absence. A cheerful fire roared within the hearth, and a tray laden with buttered toast and a fresh pot of steaming pekoe tea awaited us upon the small side table. I sank gratefully into my worn leather armchair, stretching my aching legs toward the blaze, while Holmes discarded his Inverness cape with characteristic carelessness and paced leisurely to the window. He parted the heavy velvet curtains slightly, staring out into the quiet street below with an expression of serene detachment. A satisfactory conclusion to a most singular affair, Watson, Holmes murmured, turning away from the glass and sinking into his own armchair. He steepled his long, stained fingers, his grey eyes catching the amber firelight. The government is pacified, the syndicate lies dismantled in the subterranean cells of Bow Street, and Elias Thorne is currently sleeping the peaceful sleep of an innocent man. Even the Prime Minister's brandy was surprisingly tolerable. Tolerable, I chuckled, pouring 2 cups of tea and handing one to my friend. It was a vintage of extraordinary quality, Holmes, though you treat the praise of the Empire's leader as though he were merely a local fishmonger offering opinions on the morning cod. Titles and accolades are trifles, my dear Watson, Holmes replied, taking a slow, contemplative sip of his tea. The true reward lies in the exercise of the faculties, in taking a chaotic mass of contradictory falsehoods and reducing them through pure, unyielding logic to a single, elegant truth. I opened my leather-bound journal, resting my fountain pen against the pristine vellum page where my previous notes lay inscribed. And what a truth it was! A locked room that defied the laws of physics, a forged protocol of state, and a clever delayed release mechanism operated from an empty corridor. It reads like the plot of a Gothic romance rather than a chapter of real-world crime. Reality, Watson, is infinitely more fantastic than any fiction concocted by the human mind, Holmes observed, leaning back and closing his eyes for a momentary respite, because human imagination is bound by the predictable limitations of our own desires, whereas reality operates without mercy, driven by the cold mechanics of cause and effect. We sat in comfortable silence for a time, the crackle of the hearth providing a soothing counterpoint to the distant rumble of London traffic outside. I dipped my pen into the inkwell and began to write the final lines of the chronicle, detailing the collapse of the false Mycroft's conspiracy and the vindication of logic over illusion. Suddenly, a sharp, familiar knock sounded upon our sitting-room door. Before either of us could invite the visitor in, the door swung open to reveal the unmistakable, sharp-featured countenance of Inspector Lestrade. The detective inspector looked thoroughly exhausted, his collar slightly rumpled, and his coat damp from the evening mist, but a triumphant grin stretched across his face. "Ah, Inspector," I exclaimed, rising to my feet, "do join us. There is still a drop of the Prime Minister's brandy left in the decanter, and Mrs. Hudson's toast is quite fresh." Lestrade waved away the offer with an energetic sweep of his hand, striding into the room and dropping a thick bundle of official documents onto the green blotter. "I cannot stay long, gentlemen, but I felt you should be the very first to know. The magistrate has officially dropped all charges against Elias Thorne. He was released an hour ago, and the Home Office has quietly arranged a passage for him to start anew in Canada, complete with a generous settlement." "A just resolution," Holmes remarked calmly, not bothering to open his eyes. The poor fellow was merely a convenient scapegoat for a far more sophisticated criminal apparatus. "And as for the impostor and his bearded confederate," Lestrade continued, rubbing his hands together with professional satisfaction, "they have made a full confession under interrogation. The subterranean vault at Charing Cross has been completely cleared, and the stolen antiquities are already being catalogued for return. Colonel Moran's network in the East is effectively shattered beyond repair." Lestrade paused, looking toward Holmes with an expression of profound, albeit reluctant, admiration. "I must confess, Mr. Holmes, when you first told me the locked room murder was committed before the door was ever bolted, I thought you had taken leave of your senses. Even now, the mechanics of that silk thread and the spring-loaded bolt sound like a conjurer's trick rather than police work." Holmes finally opened his grey eyes, fixing the inspector with a keen, piercing gaze. "It is all a matter of seeing what others merely look at, Lestrade. When you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the ultimate reality." Lestrade chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, whatever you call it, London owes you a debt it can never properly repay. I shall leave you to your peace, gentlemen. Good evening." With a brisk nod, the inspector turned and departed, his footsteps echoing down the wooden stairs until the front door clicked shut below. I returned to my desk, adding Lestrade's final update to the bottom of my manuscript page. The narrative was complete, from the baffling hook in the foggy Baker Street morning to the subterranean showdown beneath Charing Cross. I closed the journal with a soft, resonant thud, feeling a deep sense of literary fulfillment. Holmes, meanwhile, had reached over to his violin case, lifting the polished instrument from its velvet lining with gentle reverence. He tucked it beneath his chin, closed his eyes, and began to draw the bow across the strings. There was no triumphal fanfare, no grand declaration of victory, just a pure, soaring melody that filled our Baker Street rooms, cutting through the silence of the night and dancing out into the misty streets of London. The case was closed, the illusion was shattered, and the world was once again turning upon its axis, at least until the next curious client rang our doorbell. Chapter 11. The last act of Baker Street, the final notes of Holmes's violin, faded slowly into the quiet sanctuary of our sitting room, leaving behind a profound and reflective stillness. The manuscript of the Penhaligon mystery lay heavy and complete upon my desk, a thick stack of vellum pages chronicling a labyrinth of deception, hidden ledgers, and locked-room illusions that had nearly fractured the highest levels of the British government. Holmes gently laid his instrument back into its velvet-lined case, securing the brass clasps with a soft click. He walked over to the armchair by the hearth, sinking into the cushions with a slow, deliberate grace, and stared into the glowing embers of the fire. "You know, Watson," Holmes began, his voice breaking the stillness with a quiet, contemplative resonance, "there is a peculiar melancholy that invariably follows the close of a truly stimulating investigation. The puzzle is solved, the machinery of justice has ground its coarse wheat, and the stage is left entirely bare once more." I closed the cover of my journal and turned in my chair to face him. "Melancholy, Holmes. Most men would call it peace. We have just averted a major international scandal, saved an innocent man from the gallows, and received the personal gratitude of the Prime Minister himself." A faint, self-deprecating smile touched the corners of my friend's mouth. "Peace, my dear fellow, is merely the rust that accumulates upon a razor's edge. A mind like mine does not thrive in tranquil pastures. It hungers for the friction of conflicting motives, the subtle dissonance of human deceit, and the beautiful, uncompromising symmetry of pure logic." He reached out and picked up the cold pipe resting on the side table, turning it idly between his long, stained fingers, without lighting it. Yet, I noted, watching him closely, this particular case had a unique gravity to it. It was not merely a matter of stolen jewels or domestic blackmail. It touched upon the vast, dark underbelly of empire, ghosts of the East, as Sir Arthur called them, and men who believed their positions placed them above the law. Power and corruption are eternal constants, Watson, Holmes replied, his grey eyes reflecting the dying embers of the fire. Men like the false Mycroft and his syndicate mistake authority for immunity. They construct elaborate fortresses of influence, assuming that if an illusion is complex enough, the human mind will simply surrender its critical faculties and accept the fiction as fact. But illusion is a fragile fabric. It requires only a single thread of inconsistency, a misplaced scent of bitter almond oil, a smudge of chalky gravel upon a boot, or a chronological flaw in a locked room narrative, to unravel the entire tapestry. And the true Mycroft, the government attaché, who actually exists, has he expressed any further concern regarding the fallout? I asked. Holmes chuckled softly. Mycroft, my brother, possesses a mind quite as sharp as my own, though he prefers to exercise it from the comfortable, upholstered depths of the Diogenes Club rather than running through the fog of the East End. He sent a brief, characteristically terse note this afternoon, expressing his gratitude that the impostor's clumsy theatricals were terminated before they caused permanent embarrassment to the Crown. He also suggested, rather dryly, that I might find a less politically sensitive hobby for my next endeavour. I laughed aloud at the thought of Mycroft Holmes offering advice on discretion. As if you could ever choose a hobby that did not involve breaking half the laws of Scotland Yard in the pursuit of truth. Quite so, Holmes agreed, rising gracefully from his chair and walking over to the window. He parted the curtains to look out upon Baker Street, where the gas lamps cast long, flickering shadows against the brick facades of the opposing houses. The street was quiet, wrapped in the cool embrace of the midnight air. "The fog is returning, Watson," Holmes murmured, his tone shifting back to its familiar, razor-sharp alertness. I stood up from my desk and walked to his side, gazing out into the dim, swirling mist that had begun to creep lazily across the pavement. A typical London night. Indeed, Holmes said, a subtle spark returning to his eyes. And somewhere out there in the dark, a carriage is rolling toward our door at this very moment. A client with a desperate narrative, a seemingly impossible predicament, and a profound need for an uncommissioned intellect. Even as he spoke, the faint, distant clip-clop of horse hooves echoed up the deserted street, growing steadily louder as the vehicle approached our building. We listened in silence as the carriage drew to a halt directly beneath our window, followed by the heavy, hurried tread of footsteps upon the pavement below. Holmes turned away from the glass, his ascetic features alive with a renewed, predatory intensity. He swept his dressing gown aside with a theatrical flourish and reached for his magnifying glass. "The game, my dear Watson," Sherlock Holmes whispered with a sharp, triumphant smile, "is once more afoot." Chapter 12. The unending tapestry, the hurried footsteps upon the wooden stairs outside our door were light, frantic, and entirely devoid of the heavy, measured cadence of Scotland Yard inspectors or high-ranking government officials. There was an unmistakable desperation in the rhythm, a breathless urgency that spoke of terror, and a mind pushed to the absolute brink of sanity. Holmes did not move from his position beside the hearth, though his sharp, aquiline features tightened with intense, predatory interest. He slipped his magnifying glass back into his waistcoat pocket, his grey eyes fixed entirely upon the wooden portal. "Not a statesman, Watson," Holmes murmured, a faint, sardonic smile playing upon his lips. "Nor a Scotland Yard constable. Notice the irregular cadence of the step-light, hurried and uneven. Our new client has been running for a considerable distance, and terror is a remarkably poor instructor of steady footfalls." Before I could reach for my service, revolver, or offer a reply, a sharp, frantic rattle shook the brass door handle. Without waiting for an invitation, the door swung wide open, colliding heavily against the interior wainscoting. Framed in the doorway stood a young woman of perhaps 24 summers. Her appearance was a picture of aristocratic distress. She wore an expensive, velvet-trimmed traveling cloak, yet it was thoroughly drenched with the midnight mist and mud splattered along the hem. Her blonde hair, usually pinned in the meticulous fashion of high society, was coming unfastened, stray tendrils framing a face pale as alabaster and wide with unmitigated panic. She stood swaying slightly in the threshold, her chest heaving as she fought for breath before her knees abruptly buckled. "Good heavens!" I cried, springing forward across the Persian rug just in time to catch her by the elbows, guiding her gently into the comfortable leather armchair that Holmes had vacated moments before. Holmes was instantly in motion. With swift, silent grace, he poured a small measure of restorative brandy from our crystal decanter and held it to her trembling lips. "Drink this slowly, madam. You are entirely safe within these four walls, though I perceive you have travelled through a very dark valley to reach them." The young woman took a hesitant sip of the spirit, coughing softly as the warmth hit her throat. The colour slowly began to return to her cheeks, and her wide, dark eyes darted from me to Holmes, resting finally upon my friend's sharp, penetrating gaze. You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes," she gasped, her voice trembling like a leaf in an autumn wind. "The consulting detective. I am he, and this is my colleague." "Dr. John Watson," Holmes replied smoothly, his tone adopting that soothing, hypnotic cadence that had calmed the nerves of dukes and destitutes alike. "You may compose yourself, miss. Let us not rush. You left your family estate in Hampshire in great haste this evening, likely catching the midnight express from Waterloo Station. You purchased your ticket with hurried coins. Your maid was left behind in a state of hysterics, and you possess a secret of such magnitude that it compelled you to brave the London fog alone at this ungodly hour." The young woman stared at Holmes in absolute, stunned disbelief, the glass slipping slightly from her trembling fingers. How could you possibly know all of that?" I have not uttered a single word. Holmes offered a faint, dismissive wave of his long fingers. "Child's play, my dear young lady. The ink stain upon your right thumb is of a distinct violet-hued variety manufactured exclusively by the Winchester Railway ticket office. The mud upon your boots is the rich, chalky marl characteristic of the Hampshire Downs. Furthermore, the silver locket swinging from your neck bears the engraved crest of the Earl of Dunsany, yet the clasp is hastily buckled backward, the unmistakable sign of a woman dressing in the absolute dark of terror." She pressed a gloved hand to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. My father is the Earl, and he is convinced he is losing his mind. Or worse, someone is systematically, brilliantly driving him toward an early grave." Holmes pulled his own armchair closer, sitting directly opposite her, his entire demeanour shifting from casual indifference to acute, razor-sharp focus. The Penhaligon affair, the locked room mystery, the syndicate of Charing Cross, all of it vanished into the background, instantly eclipsed by this new unfolding tragedy. "Pray, Miss Dunsany," Holmes said softly, his grey eyes shining with the fierce, unquenchable fire of intellectual hunger, "begin at the beginning and omit nothing. What manner of ghost has found its way into your ancestral home?" I stood watching them for a moment, a quiet smile touching my lips as I walked back to my writing desk. The manuscript of our previous triumph rested peacefully beside my inkwell, but its final pages were already history. The world outside our window remained a vast, churning ocean of deception, shadows, and human folly, and London would forever demand its master of logic. I uncapped my fountain pen, pulled a fresh sheet of vellum toward me, and prepared to record the opening lines of our next adventure.